In this video, I am absolutely delighted to be joined by a very special guest. We're going to be talking about practice, which is a great topic for any time, any season. It's always great to be learning more and getting new perspectives on making your practice more effective and more efficient, but especially with it being back to school time, community band rehearsals starting up again for the fall. It's a perfect time to have this great conversation with Jenny McClay of Jenny Clarinet. All of her links to her website and her fantastic blog are in the description, so if you want to get all kinds of great clarinet information, that is a fantastic resource for you. I'm so glad that she was able to take the time and share some of her best practice tips and have this great discussion with me on practice. So without further ado, let's jump into it and get some great tips to make this your best year of practice yet. So I'm so excited to be here and joined by my wonderful guest, Jenny McClay of Jenny Clarinet. Jenny, do you want to say anything to get started?
No, just I'm excited to be here. Thanks so much for having me. And I'm really looking forward to talking about practicing. I know it's important for clarinetists, which we both are, but for every musician, I think the more streamlined your practice routine is, the better you can accomplish things in the practice room, get out, do other things too that aren't music, and then just you could reach your goals a lot quicker if you have a structured practice routine.
Yeah, I love it. Speaking of structure to the practice routine, I think it'd be a good place to start with outlining sort of the rough structure of a practice routine. So there's a few different aspects and categories when it comes to how to organize your practice. And we're going to be going in depth with a lot of things today, which I'm really excited about. But starting off, I think you need to consider how often you're practicing. So is it every day, during the weekdays? I think the bare minimum for productive practice is 3 times a week. There's some research and studies that come and relate to exercise, where exercising, you have to do it 3 times a week to sort of see progress and results. And I think it applies to practicing too. At the bare minimum, 3 times a week. Generally, the more the better. Personally, I practice on the weekdays and then take weekends off. And we'll probably talk about taking breaks and things like that coming up as well. And then once you have the days that you're practicing, then there's the actual session itself. And for me, I think a general hour-long practice session should be broken up into about a third of it warming up, and then you can break up the other thirds into focusing on pieces. So if you're doing an hour-long session, 20 minutes of warming up. I like the 3-step warm up. We'll talk about the 3T warm up here in a bit too. And then 20 minutes on a piece. Maybe it's an etude, maybe it's a solo piece that you're working on, maybe it's band music, and then 20 minutes on another one of those. And usually I'll do the first 20 minutes, and especially for students, I'll recommend that to be sort of the etude time as a bridge towards pieces and repertoire. And then the last 20 minutes is your band music, your solo rep, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think I would agree. Something similar, a 20-20-20 is a really good layout. I would say a lot of it also depends on your goals. Maybe if you have a recital coming up, you would consider doing a shorter warm up just to get to the recital music. But that being said, we'll talk a little bit too about focusing on fundamentals. I have a lot to say about that and just making sure your fundamentals are at an adequate level. But I think putting in a decent warm up, both physically and mentally, to get the air moving, to get your body ready to practice is really important. So 20 minutes is a great warm up time. That gives you time to do tone, the other T's that we'll talk about. So a lot of different fundamentals in your warm up. And then depending on whatever else you have to do, 20 minutes on an etude, a couple of etudes if you have those assigned, and then 20 minutes on the repertoire or anything else that you wanted to practice.
Yeah. Let's maybe talk about planning a little bit more and how to have that really concrete plan. I think for me, I'm not the best at planning. What do you think, Jenny? What is your sort of procedures and process when it comes to like really knowing what you need to be tackling in your practice?
I think a lot of that happens before the practice session. I think that's where I see a lot of mistakes is people go into the practice session and they say, I don't know what to practice. And then it's not very effective because they haphazardly, I'll play this, no, I'll play this. Oh, this is out here. Let me look at this. I try to make plans maybe on the days that I'm not practicing, say, okay, I have this recital coming up. I'm playing this, and this piece. And then I look through the pieces individually and say, this section's sort of difficult. Let me look at this section. So I go through and I star the sections that I need to work on. And that's my planning approach. You can get a lot more formalized than that. I've created boot camps, very specific practice routines, which work well. I think I do a lot of that in my head for mine, but just knowing what pieces you have to practice or what warm up kind of exercises you want to practice, and then knowing where in the music you need to start. That's another mistake I see is a lot of people, I need to practice this piece, and then they play the easy parts or something like this.
Yeah, I like that. I think that really applies to that idea of deliberate practice, right? We need to be deliberate about what do we actually need to achieve and accomplish. I also think there's massive benefits to sort of motivation and productivity when you do that and have sort of your checklist of like, these are the things that I need to tackle today, where you can get in there, focus on those things, check them off your list. And then by the end of the session, you feel like you've really accomplished something. Whereas when you're sort of just meandering through, maybe you are making progress and you're checking things off the list. But since you don't actually have a list and you aren't actually checking it off, the brain doesn't get that like reward of like, yes, I did something and actually accomplished it. So I think there's a lot of benefit to having a physical plan and a physical list. And I think I should listen to my own advice and do that more.
I think all of us should. It's one thing to say. Something that maybe is simpler of a list seems like too much to do on a daily routine for every practice session. Something that I always do is just tidy my space. I'm very neat and organized, so I don't like visual clutter. I don't like mental clutter, but I tidy the practice stand. So I'll take all the music off that I don't need to work on the next time. I pack the clarinet up, and then afterwards I leave the music on the stand that I'm going to practice the next time. Even if it's a rough idea, I might look at it and say, oh, I don't need to practice this today. This is more of a priority. I really need to work on this piece. So just having everything organized, that way you can just go in the next time and start. You don't have to dig through your music or find that piece or look through the etudes. It's all right there ready to go.
Yeah, I love that. Having the sort of environment primed so that you're on the right track and distraction free. I think also speaking of distractions, it's really important to not let our phones be distracting us with all the notifications and things like that. It's so easy to fall into those traps. And I think whatever we can do ahead of time to set ourselves up for success is really what we need to. Do you have any last thoughts for sort of ahead of time setting yourself up for success in that sort of planning phase?
I think maybe this could overlap with a few other things we'll talk about, but maybe planning out when you'll practice. I think we both agree that maybe we try to practice in the morning just because it's easier to get it done and out of the way, because there's nothing worse than the feeling of going through the day like I need to practice. I still need to practice. And it's a terrible feeling to have that weight on your shoulders all day. So if possible, practice in the morning. If you can't, at least have a plan. Like I'm going to practice after this class. I'm going to practice at 6 p.m. after work. So have some kind of structure so you don't just think I need to practice. Oops, it's too late. I can't practice. I'll wait until tomorrow. Just be as organized as you can with everything.
That's excellent. I really agree completely. There's a lot of research and stuff that I've been reading and exploring lately, and just sort of how humans work too. And I think most of us are most productive in the mornings. There's a few different types of people. And if you know that you're a night owl and love to practice late at night, then that's totally fine too. But I think the most important key there is having that dedicated time and sort of like your sacred practice time. And I find personally that always the best way is to schedule it like an appointment. So if you have a class at 10 a.m., you're going to go to that class. If you're a good student, you're going to go to that class because it's an appointment that's committed and scheduled in your calendar. I think you need to do the same thing with your practicing. For whatever reason, I think practicing sort of gets that idea that it's like, oh, it's just the sort of fun thing that I do when and if I have time. And if you have that approach to it, then you're always going to be sort of at that amateur hobbyist, just sort of experimenting with it level. When you actually start scheduling it and committing to it, that's when you start to make real progress and sort of have that professional mindset behind it. Shall we talk about some fundamentals and warm-up stuff? That's my absolute favorite topic. So when it comes to fundamentals and warming up, I think that's the foundation of everything that we do. I have this idea, I call it the sort of grand unified theory of music, and it's three things: triangle. I love my triangles. It starts with fundamentals of playing the clarinet or whatever instrument. That's the one corner of it where everything starts. Then we also have the music side of it, actually being able to know the music and understand what the music wants us to convey. And then the last one is performing and being able to perform confidently and consistently. And I think if any part of that triangle is missing, then you'll struggle to find success. If you are great at playing the clarinet, but you haven't taken the time to study the music and understand the style and the interpretation, then it's not going to sound very interesting. If you're great at understanding the music and great clarinet fundamentals so that you can get the clarinet to do what the music wants, but you're terrible at performing, nobody's going to want to watch you. If you're great at the music, great at performing, but you can't actually get the clarinet to do what you want it to do, then you're also not going to have much success. So I think those are the three things to always be thinking about. And I think the warm-up is where we tackle the fundamentals of actually playing the clarinet and figuring out how to sound good, wiggle our fingers, wiggle the tongue, and all of that good stuff. And that's my 3-step warm-up, is for those 3 fundamental things, right? Sound good in your long tones, wiggle the fingers well in your technique, and articulate well, move the tongue well in the articulation exercises. And I saw, I think it was a couple of years ago now, on Jenny's blog, the 3 T's warm-up of tone, technique, and tonguing. And I was like, dang it, why didn't I come up with that? That's so much cooler sounding than the 3-step warm-up. But maybe, Jenny, do you want to talk about your ideas with that?
Yeah, so I love the idea, what you call it, the triangle. What was the name? The unity
Yeah,
of
the grand unified theory of music.
I
Yeah.
love that. No, that's such a good point to make too. So I'll focus on the little fundamentals corner. So the 3 T's, I think that encompasses a lot of fundamentals. So tone, one of our strong, it's hard to say one is more important than the rest, but without a good sound, it's hard to convey much else in music. So tone, we practice through long tone and other tone building exercises. Technique would be scales, any kind of exercises, like you said, to wiggle the fingers, to train them to work well together, with quality first and then speed as you develop all the fundamentals of proper finger position, proper hand position, and then articulation or tonguing. Those are the 3 main ones, but there's so many other smaller ones that go into that: posture, breathing. The list goes on and on and on. So like I said, that's sort of the umbrella term for all of those, but I think a good warm-up routine can't be complete without all of those. So do some kind of long tone exercise, do some kind of technique exercise, which is probably scales, do some kind of articulation or tonguing exercise. And there's all kinds of books written for each of these specifically. I'm a big fan too of multitasking and warming up. So with long tones, it's hard to multitask. You can't really do technique in long tones. Certain aspects of technique, maybe the movement of the fingers or things like this. But for me, when I multitask, I incorporate a lot of the repertoire into long tones. So if I'm working on a Brahms sonata, I might play it very, very slowly for the tricky intervals. That might be my long tone routine for that day. The technique would be some kind of scales based on the Brahms sonatas or general technique building exercises, and then maybe looking to parts of the Brahms to see what I can extrapolate to use for articulation practice. Just because I think we both love practicing. I do. I really enjoy practicing most of the time, but also I love doing other things that aren't in the practice room and going out and seeing the world. And I think it's another reason we want to be very efficient in the practice room, so you can get out and enjoy life, which I think in turn makes you a better musician.
I think that's a great idea too, because it's not just helping you to get the fundamentals down, but it actually helps on the piece a ton as well. The idea of thinking about it in a different way, where you take a tricky to voice passage and sort of long tonify it, that's a great way to really get your long tones in, get warmed up, but also actually have really good, purposeful, meaningful practice of the music. So I love that multitasking idea. I also think with the multitasking, maybe to a warning with that is you want to be careful that in the multitasking, you're always able to focus on the thing that matters. So in your long tones, it's sound quality. In the technique, it's your finger motion. And in the articulation, it's the tongue motion. I think sometimes we get bogged down where we maybe are doing like slur to tongue to scales and we're multitasking technique and articulation. But sometimes, especially if it's maybe in a little bit less familiar key or you're going at a tempo a little bit faster than you're comfortable, you're just worried about trying to do the right articulation and trying to get the fingers in the right place, but you're not actually thinking about the quality of those things. And I think that's where it really makes the difference. And I love, Jenny, that you said it's about quality and then speed. I think that's really super duper important, is you have to get it sounding great and then add complexity. And that's why I always start with the long tones, because it's just simple, one note at a time, get it sounding great. Then we can move the fingers a little bit more in the technique, then move the tongue a little bit in the articulation, then maybe do an etude. And that's sort of our bridge to whatever music we're working on. One other thing with the sort of 3T warm-up that I really like as well is that I personally think that's everything that we have to do in music. There's no matter how complicated the music gets, all we have to do is sound good, wiggle the fingers to the right place at the right time, and do whatever articulation's written. Like there's nothing more than that, whether it's Mary Had a Little Lamb or Corigliano Concerto. It's all just the same fundamentals like across the board.
And I think too, another point that I want to bring up is the fact that you're spending a lot of time on fundamentals. So it's great to have a warm up. I know some days you're pressed for time, you need to focus more on the rep that you're playing. But I think if you have a chunk of time to really focus on fundamentals and maybe make it 40% or 40 minutes out of that hour we talked about, like 40 to 45 minutes is the fundamentals, and then less time on the music, I think over time that's going to serve you well. I know for a while, my crazy secret for clarinet, I didn't warm up. I had too much music. I wanted to play the solos. I didn't care about warming up, and I got by. Somehow I skirted by well enough, but I really noticed an improvement when I focused on doing scale work, going through the Behrman book, and started long tones and articulation exercises. I could learn music so much faster. It's not that I couldn't learn it before, but it might take me a month to learn a piece of music, whereas after I felt like I built up my fundamentals, it might take me a week or 2 weeks depending on the piece. So that's going to have a long-term payoff too. The more that you focus on fundamentals when you're able to, I think that's going to contribute a lot to your musical growth.
Something that I've found in my playing too along those lines is that when I do a good warm-up and really get everything flowing, it feels like I'm also sort of calibrating myself to the instrument and sort of figuring out how the reed is feeling for the day and just what I need to do to get my best sound. And then when I go on to the rep, it's so much easier because I'm not fighting the clarinet. Whereas when you're in that space of, oh, I don't have time, I'll just breeze through the warm-up really quick or even skip the warm-up and go right to the music, you find that you're spending so much time fighting the clarinet that that's what you're doing in the music rather than learning the music. You're just wrestling with the clarinet and trying to get it to do what you want. Whereas when you go the other way, really get that warm up, get calibrated and everything flowing well, then sometimes the music just plays itself, especially if you know the music well.
Mm-hmm. And I would say one more note on the warm up too, is to make sure you don't go on autopilot. That's a lot easier said than done. That's something we're all guilty of, but a good practice routine is also an exercise in mindfulness because our minds wander. That's human nature. But I tell students, especially during long tones, if you finish long tones and you realize, I don't know what I just played, it's like when you drive somewhere and you think, I don't remember much of that drive, but you've arrived to the destination. It's probably not very good, definitely not safe driving, but for long tones, you're not getting the full benefit. You should always be actively thinking, how is my tone? There was a break in the sound there. How can I fix that? How's my posture? How's my this? How's my that? And then over time, you want to improve. I say, even if you could make one thing 1% better every day, that's improvement over time. So that's how we build up these small successes. They might not seem like much from day to day, but if you look back, you could see how far you've come. So much as possible, try to train yourself in mindfulness so you're not finishing the warm-up routine, like you said, and you're not getting the full benefits.
Absolutely. I'm always saying if you're bored doing your warm-ups, then you're doing something wrong. Even the same simple warm-up exercise that I've done for years and years and years and years still is really engaging because I'm trying to find today, how does it feel like to play the clarinet and what can I do to be my best? Not to talk about fundamentals and warm-ups all day because I'm sure we could. I think just one other quick thought. When you're really finding your best every day, it's going to feel different. You're not going to like have a linear, even 1% better linearly every day. I also think there's a common misconception that once we get good enough, then we don't have to worry about the fundamental things anymore. But I actually think it's very much the opposite of that, where every day I'm taking all of the knowledge that I know, but I'm pretending that the clarinet is completely new and I'm trying to figure out what it feels like to find my best sound. And I have a really clear image of what my best sound is and what I want to sound like, but I have no idea how it's going to feel like to do that on the clarinet today. So it's always a new experiment and exploration into what does it feel like to play the clarinet today. And hopefully that's 1% better than it was yesterday, but sometimes maybe it's 10% worse because probably the reed, I'll blame the reed. But it's something to always be thinking. Like, you're never going to be like, I'm good enough now. I don't need to worry about how I sound on long tones. It's every day is a new day to find your very best.
And if you think that you sound your best, please let us know what your secret is.
Yeah. If you figured out how to no longer have to do warm-ups. I love warm-ups, but I'm all for being more efficient and not having to do that. That'd be great. But I think the secret is the warm-ups, actually. Yeah. So let's go on now. We've done our sort of warm-ups. We've tackled those 3 T's. We got the fundamentals of the clarinet going really well. Now we're in the next stage of our practice of the etudes or the repertoire that we're working on. What do you do when you get started into that stage? Like, what's your game plan going into that, and how do you actually make sure that you're productive in that?
I start with the hardest section first, or the sections that need work. So when I go through the planning, like I said, I star or circle or have a mental idea of what needs work. So I try and tackle the toughest thing first. That's what they tell you in productivity. I guess books, they'll say do the hardest thing first, your task on your to-do list. I try to imitate that some in practicing. So start where you need work. It's fine too. Some days I'll try and read through it. Maybe I'll have a little bit of performance practice just to see how it held up from the day before. So play through all of that, but then go to the sections that need work. I would say that's one of the biggest, maybe ineffective ways that people will practice is they'll play the whole piece and then they say, oh, well, the middle section, that's where it needs work. And then they go back to the beginning and try again for the middle section and just zoom in right where that is, go to that measure, that phrase, that single note, those 2 notes. Zoom in first, and then you could start zooming out as you get all of the technical and the fundamental elements, and you could start focusing on performance practice.
I think a good way to sort of break up the idea of practicing is into 2 broad categories, and then we can really dive into the details there. The 2 broad categories I find, and this is sort of coming from my very limited understanding of neuroscience, is that we have sort of the encoding phase where we're getting new information into our brain. And then we have the recall phase, which is the performance side of things, where in practice, when we're learning something new, we have to program it. But then in performance, we have to be able to execute what we've programmed. And I think those are 2 different skills. And I think it's important to keep those in mind as far as making sure that you're doing both of those and training both of those. Now, going into the encoding part first, where we're sort of programming the brain, I think that's what Jenny was just talking about, of like finding those hard parts, digging into them, really getting them solid. I have my sort of framework for that I call the 3 I's of practice, which is the first I is to identify. So that's what she was talking about, of like, what are the actual challenging parts that you need to work on? Then you isolate those parts. And this is the most common mistake. I think we both agree this is probably the most common mistake of practice, is that we'll start at the beginning and play through and be like, oh, measure 20 had an issue. Okay, I'm going to go back to the beginning and hope that I get measure 20 this time. And that's maybe a type of recall practice that could be useful if you're in that performance mode of practice. If you already know that measure 20 is in there, you just need to make sure that you're able to execute it, then that can be a valid form of practice. Most people, though, don't actually have measure 20 in there, and they just go at it again with their fingers crossed that for some reason it's going to be better this time. It doesn't really work that way. We have to isolate it and improve it. So just measure 20, just 2 beats of measure 20, go slow, do whatever it takes to get it and improve it. Then the last step is sort of on the recall side of integrating it together and then making sure you can go back to the beginning of the phrase or maybe the beginning of the piece and make sure it goes well in context. And even that you can integrate sort of in steps where you're not doing the whole piece and seeing if measure 20 goes well, but you do then measure 19 through 21, then 16 through 24, and start building it up that way.
I like that. And I think I wrote a blog post about it. I have to give the disclaimer, I've never made a quilt, but I know the general procedure sort of creating a quilt. You start with one square. So that's our practice square. We go into measure 20 for this example. So you practice that square. And then once that square is good, maybe you go to a different square, measure 19, and you put them together. Because I think another common practice thing is we forget transitions. So 20 might be good, 19 might be good, but putting them together can be tricky. So everything you said, I think those are all really good points. And then I would also add that maybe understanding the difference between live performance errors or just one-time things. There was a random accident. I messed up there because I was thinking about what I'm going to eat for lunch or whatever the reason is. And then issues like, oh yeah, that's happened every time, or I usually cannot get this right. Because I've seen people focus on both things. They'll know, okay, this needs work, but then a lot of people, they make a random mistake and they, oh no, what happened? What's this? Don't think about it too much. If it happens again, maybe see what the issue would be. But those random one-off mistakes, those don't concern me typically because performances have those. That's part of performing. So training your mindset to know the difference between the one-off examples like that and then more issues that you should work on when you're practicing.
I like that. That's something that I used to think when I was performing. If in the performance, the hard stuff that I was worried about, if that went well and then there were other little mistakes, then it was a good performance. But when that hard stuff that you worked really, really hard on and it's still not there, then that's when you know that either you didn't have enough time to prepare for it or didn't take enough time to prepare for it, or you just needed to be practicing it and working on it in a different way to make sure that you're actually getting it. That's a good little litmus test. I like that idea a lot.
I like that. That's true. Yeah, those random performance things, you'll never guess the places where you'll make mistakes in live performance.
Let's actually dive in a little bit more into the sort of encoding side of things. So we talked about isolating as one really helpful thing there. I'll add along with isolating, it's really, really important to be simplifying. So smaller chunks is one way of simplifying, and isolating already is. I also think going slower is a really important way to simplify. The goal there is we need to be doing it correct. The neuroscience, again, with my limited, not scientist understanding of it, is that our brain just gets better at doing whatever it's doing. So we want to make sure that in our practice, we're doing it correct. And that's why we do the smaller chunks. That's why we go slower and make sure that it's 100% correct. So that's one side of the encoding thing. Another interesting part of encoding, I think, is not going through it mindlessly. I think we've all done that where we practice the fast run just time, but it still feels like, yeah, maybe 70% of the time it's fine, but there's still sometimes that there's issues. What strategies do you have to sort of conquer that? I've been doing this over and over and over again, but how do I like really make sure it's solid?
I would say to bust out the different practice approaches. So maybe you have, go through it slowly. That usually works. As you bump it up, I slow it down and just make sure there's no fundamental issues holding me up. So maybe it's my finger position. My fingers are too far away from the keys or something simple like that, and then rework it up. Some other techniques that I use when things just don't want to cooperate, I'll change the rhythms some. So altered rhythms, practicing. I'll do add a note. So maybe the first note, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. I do it backwards too. 5, 4, 5, 4, 3, 5, 4, 3, 2. Any kind of different practice approach that you could think of. Again, I'm not a neuroscience person at all. So something in your brain does something when you change how you practice it. If you just play straight 16th notes, your brain operates differently if you alter the rhythm or do any of these parameters. So changing it up, trying different techniques. I think this is in the troubleshooting mode too, is get creative. What if I tried this? What if I did this? I use an approach in practicing a lot of times. I call it devil's advocate. What would be the worst way to play this? How can I make this worse? And then, oh, that did make it worse. So maybe like, this is contributing because when I made it worse, it was by changing my embouchure. So you know that embouchure is a factor that's maybe affecting it from getting better. So don't be afraid to experiment. What if I played with these finger positions? What if I used more air? What if I used less air? Sort of random tidbit here that I thought I'd share. I really believe that air is the cause for the majority of our problems in the practice room. I'm guessing 90% is air related. So even technique, support more air, use more air. I won't say that it makes it completely better, but it probably helps. So first thing that I do when I'm troubleshooting, how's my air? Usually not good enough. Otherwise I wouldn't have that issue. So always go back to air.
Oh man, that's a very tantalizing tangent. Again, I could talk all day about the
Oh
benefits of
yeah.
air. Yeah, I
Mhm.
agree completely that that's a great first place to start. I also really love all of those things that you said. I like the devil's advocate approach. I've kind of heard about that, but not in quite so like eloquent of a way of putting it. So I really like that approach. And what you're getting at there with like practice rhythms, dotted rhythms, going backwards, add a note. Another one that I like is changing the grouping. So if it's in
Yeah.
16th notes, do it as if it was triplets or as if it was quintuplets, that kind of stuff. Isolated groupings, I really like on a 16th note run, instead of doing the whole run, I'll do like a 2 3 4 1 and then loop that. So you do 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1. So you're practicing just one small grouping in there. But all of those different strategies, and again, you can be creative and inventive and come up with all kinds of different things to do. I would put those under the umbrella of desirable difficulty. And that's the like fancy neuroscience thing where our brains are really learning when we're in that zone of desirable difficulty, and we kind of have to think about it. And I think that's why it works, is because we're having to think about it. You can play through the measure of 16th notes mindlessly thousands of times, and you're sort of just running the one neural network. But when you start doing it with practice rhythms or backwards or add a note, that's a different angle of looking at it. And all of a sudden, your brain has to think harder, and it starts building these sort of adjacent neural networks. And then it sort of builds together into this much stronger thing that you can then do much more efficiently and effectively once you relax and have good air behind it.
Always use the air. I will say too, another mistake I see a lot in the practice room is that people go too fast too soon. So a lot of times when they can't get from 70% to 100%, it's usually that they're using a metronome and maybe they go from 50. Oh, cool, I did this like twice. I'm going to jump to 70 or something like this. So go slow, stay slower longer. I think that's another valuable practice piece of advice that I would share with everyone. The longer you stay slower, you're building up the fundamentals. Just like if you go to the gym, I use this analogy a lot in teaching, and you're trying to lift weights. You would start with like 5 pound weights and like get good at those and then go to 10 pounds. But if you skip from 10 to 50, you could probably do it. It's not good for your body, but you're not teaching yourself the right muscles, the right way your body should operate. Practicing is the same thing. So slower, longer, build the right muscles, the right brain connections. Everything has to work together.
I'll say when it comes to speed too, the biggest enemy of speed is tension. And I think what always happens, especially when we're going too fast too soon, is we think, okay, I'm going to really do it fast this time. I'm going to really push myself. And then we're adding tension because we're trying to really push ourselves. Whereas we need to be going slow, relaxed into the beat, speed up the beat a little bit faster, but still relaxed into the beat, a little bit faster, but still relaxed into the beat. I always find when I have my like really good, clean, fast playing that happens every now and then. What's really happening and the way I'm feeling it is like, oh, this is just easy. I know where my fingers are going. This is no problem. I'm relaxed into the beat, but playing really, really fast. Something else along those lines when it comes to speeding up. Jenny, have you ever heard of the like Banad practice method?
Yeah.
Yeah, I heard about this, and I think I've really only ever truly done it on one passage. But the idea of it is you do a set of 10 repetitions on your like isolated just a couple measures, and 9 of those repetitions are at half tempo, and then 1 repetition at full tempo. And then you do 10 sets of that. So then by the end of it, you've done 90 repetitions at half tempo and 10 repetitions at full tempo. And it sounds very cumbersome and time consuming. And I think it is a little bit, but I think we can have that approach of doing it that way, like Jenny was saying, stay slower for longer, do more repetitions slower. And I will say the passage that I did that on was Peter and the Wolf excerpt, the doo dee dee doo dee 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 dee. And yeah, and I could play that without practicing for like 4 years after that really well. So it really got in there and really stuck and was worth it, especially for something that you have to do a lot, like those really challenging excerpts that always come up on auditions.
Right. Yeah. When we were talking about something earlier, my mind went to Daphnis, of course. So this is useful for anything, but especially the ones that are just very technical. I forget who to credit this to, but there's a similar approach to, and this isn't the name that they call it, but I think of it as the leapfrog approach, where you start out at half tempo, your goal is 100, you start at 50, you do it 3 times in a row at 50, then you go up a little, maybe like 55, 56, you do it once at a faster tempo, then go back to 52 or something. So the idea is 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. So it's, again, very time consuming, but it's very, very effective. That's something else I do for those technical passages that just don't want to stick. I do this method and it really works.
Yeah, I love it. So that's kind of the encoding side of practice and the tips there. What do you have for our recall side and sort of the performance practice?
I love this. I love performance practice. I think it's the most fun. I think I said that about warm-ups too. Both are the most fun for me. Practicing is fun. To do performance practice. So make sure that you're going through the whole section, the whole movement, the entire piece that you do. I'm a big fan of doing repetitions of the piece, just so you get used to the physical demands, the breathing, the technique, everything else involved, the mental acuity that you need too, because I encourage my students to do performance practice because you will make mistakes. It's not a matter of if, it's when you make a mistake. And that's true for everyone. Hopefully, as we improve, the mistakes are a lot less noticeable. But you have to teach yourself to just brush yourself off after you trip and then get up and go again, because you can't stop in a live performance and say, oops, sorry about that. Let me go back. And it's different than a practice routine. So to do the performance practice, day to day, that might look at the end of a practice session. I'll do a run through of the piece, of the movement. But when it's close to audition season, I did this in my all-state days back in high school. I went all out. I would practice all times of day just to give myself more of a mental barrier to overcome, because you don't know how you'll feel during the audition. You know what it's like to play through the piece or the etude, the excerpt. But I would get up at 2 o'clock in the morning and I would run through it with no warm up. I would do the run through when I was tired, when I was happy, when I was hungry, sad, all kinds of emotional states, physical states, within reason. This is just to train yourself for mental toughness. You don't want to push yourself. Don't be a bully to yourself. The idea is to train yourself to be a little bit more flexible. But I think practicing at different times of the day and different, states like that can really help. And then try to learn as much as you can about the performance, the audition, so you can recreate it as much. I've heard of people doing things like jumping jacks before they play through a piece, or running in place just to get the heart rate up. I don't personally do this, but if it works for you, all the better.
I've tried that before, like running up and down
Yeah.
stairs and then trying to
Ooh.
play. I think it didn't quite get the effect that I was wanting, where I like didn't have the performance nerves, the mental side of it. I was just really out of breath and had to breathe a lot more.
Right.
But if it works for you, absolutely go for it. I think along that sort of performance anxiety side too, I think it's really helpful to not raise the stakes of the performance too high. I think that's when we tend to crash and burn the most. Definitely in my personal experience, I've seen this when I'm like, oh, I think I could actually like win this competition, or like if I do well enough on this audition, then I'll be able to go to this grad school and then my life will be set after that. And I think when we raise those stakes, that's when the pressure feels much, much higher and we get overly critical and have problems like that. Before we jump back too much to the how to actually practice performance, I have a question that's like completely selfish for me, but might be helpful for other
Yeah.
people. I've found recently in my performing, and I think it's because I do so much teaching and so much like assessing and listening, that when I'm performing, I'm almost too critical of myself, and I'm really paying attention to all of those picky details, so much so that even recently, for like the first time in my playing, I've actually liked the recording better than how I felt playing it, which I think is very unusual. I always warn my students when they first start recording themselves, like, you're going to absolutely hate the recording because it's going to sound so much different than what you're used to hearing. But do you have any tips and advice for me or anybody like me where in the performance, I feel like I'm hearing mistakes that aren't even coming across on the recording?
I would say just performance experience, like anything else, performing is a skill. So just perform as much as possible. Know that it's never fun to listen to yourself. It's a very eye-opening experience. Record yourself more during the practice sessions. That way you get an idea of what you're doing. And try and learn too. I don't know if there's ever been anyone that was completely happy with a performance. Hopefully generally happy. That went well. That was good. I'm proud of this. Maybe next time I should work on this. I think that's very realistic. But keep doing things like that, and also as much as possible to play music that you love. I think that's a big thing. We don't always get to control that if you have auditions or something, but recitals where you're programming it, I love everything about recitals, picking out the music and things like that. So having more of a personal connection, and that could even be learning about the composer, learning about the history, as you figure out the music, the program, your dissertation topics, things like this, choosing things that really inspire you. I know I'm really lucky to choose music most of the time that I really like and it fascinates me. So that's what I try to do. I don't know if I have all the answers, but try and have fun as much as possible. I know for performing that's a big ask. And it's easier said than done, but keep trying to have fun.
Yeah, I think that kind of ties into the idea of lowering the stakes too. Whereas if you're doing this audition and you have to play these specific excerpts, and in your mind, you're like, I have to do this absolutely perfectly to win an audition because auditions are so competitive. And you can maybe work on that mindset a little bit too, and trust that auditions are actually winnable usually. But also having more fun with it sort of lowers that to where it's like, I just get to share this music that I enjoy with people. And if I make a mistake here and there, it's okay because I'm enjoying the process and it's not my career depends on it, for sure.
Right. And even for the excerpts, the standard pieces that we have to play, I'm paraphrasing a Leonard Bernstein quote, but find what you love and do it uniquely well. It's a longer quote, one of my favorites. Maybe I could send that to you. A beautiful quote, but even excerpts, even Beethoven 6, we all have a unique interpretation on that, even if it's within a box. We have something unique to offer with our sound, with our phrasing, with our everything that we do. So try to have your own spin on it, even if it's just, just a little for auditions. It shouldn't be the same from person to person.
I like that. Yeah. And again, that's kind of a way to lower the stakes where you're not going for unachievable perfection that they are expecting. You're just doing it how you like to do it. I love that. Going back to the idea of practicing recall, I think another important way that you can do that is it doesn't always have to be in really big chunks or playing, even performing through the whole piece or the whole program. I do think that's very beneficial to do sometimes. A couple of years ago, I was playing the Barrio Sequenza for a concert.
Ooh.
And yeah, it's like 13 minutes of just me playing by myself of very challenging music. And I knew for that one, I was going to need to do lots of runs of the entire thing all the way through to work on keeping my concentration up, keeping my endurance up, and feeling what that's actually going to feel like. I think when it comes to performance mode, though, and that's what I call it, is like practice mode is sort of when we're encoding and making sure that everything's really correct. Performance mode is when we're practicing our recall and making sure that we're able to do what we've programmed in. But you can do performance mode even on one phrase or maybe one page out of the piece of music. It doesn't always have to be the entire thing, but just making sure that the stuff that you're putting in is able to come back out cleanly and consistently. And really the best way to do that and to pull that information out cleanly and consistently is to just be doing it. That's the idea of spaced repetition, where you recall this section of music, and then you go do something else, and then you recall it again later. And that's what builds the muscle in our brain of being able to pull out the stuff that we've programmed in a correct and consistent way.
No, I like that. It's, yeah, all very true. Just a skill like anything else.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's the sort of in practice things to be doing. I think maybe just one more quick thing that we didn't get into in the encoding and recall discussion is how to actually find opportunities for improvement. So I find that that's another common mistake that people have in practice is that they play through something and they're like, "Yep, it was fine. I played it. It happened." What thoughts do you have about how to not run into that problem?
Um, I don't know if I've experienced that much personally. Usually people, oh, this was bad. I need to get this better. If you do not know where to look for, or maybe you listen and you're unsure, I would say to listen again through different lenses. So, how's my tone? How's my technique? How's this? If you really can't hear anything afterwards, share it with your friends. Maybe create like a social media account, whether it's public or private, but share it with people, share it with your teacher. I'm sure they'll have things to say. But always have a goal in mind. And I think that goes back to the goal setting too. If you're saying that's good, then maybe it genuinely is. See how you can make it closer to your goal. So you're playing a recital and you do a run through of one of the pieces. If you say that's good, how can I make it better? So I think just taking it to the next step, being proud of yourself for all of the work you've done, but always thinking, how can I take it to the next level?
Absolutely. Yeah. That's the big difference, I think, is both of those two things that you said. One is sort of raising the expectation, and the other one is looking through different lenses. For looking through the different lenses, I use the framework of the 4 opportunities for improvement. So it's rhythm, sound quality, notes, and style. So if you ever play through something and you think, well, I think I did it pretty right, but you're still looking for ways to make it better because you're still supposed to be practicing it, then think about those. How was the rhythm? Was it really steady? Did you do it with the metronome? How was the sound quality? Did every note sound the way that you want? Were there smooth transitions between the notes? How were the notes? Obviously, did you play the right notes? But even more so, were you confident playing the right notes? Did you feel like there were any moments where you kind of got lucky that the right note came out, but you weren't really deliberate about it? And then style is kind of the catch-all for everything else. Was it the tempo that you wanted? Did you have the phrasing that you wanted? Did the articulation sound the way that you wanted? All of that kind of stuff. And that's giving you ideas of what else you can be improving. But all of that is useless, or you're still going to have a hard time finding those things if you don't already know how the music goes really well and have that sort of goal in mind. So I think it's two sides of things is we have expectations that are here, and then we use the 4 opportunities to build up our playing. And we think, okay, my rhythm still wasn't good enough. Okay, that's better now. Now I need to get the sound quality. And then eventually you hit your expectation. And that's where you're going to be at that sort of impasse of like, okay, I did it. I think it sounded really good. I'm very happy with it. I thought through all 4 opportunities for improvement, and I think they were all solid. So at that point, you need to listen to some more recordings or do something to raise your expectations, share it with a friend, have a teacher there to say like, yeah, that sounded great, but there's still this and this and this and this and this that can be improved. And I think as a teacher, that's kind of my biggest philosophy, and the big thing that I'm working on is my main job is to raise students' expectations, and then it's their job to sort of practice and figure out how to do it. And I can, of course, help with that too.
That's true. And I think we should also mention there will be a point. Nothing is ever perfect or entirely finished. You could keep coming back to pieces over and over. But if you do feel like that's good, I've, gone through the 4 opportunities, your teacher seems to think that it could be time just to go into a different piece or work on different things or something and come back to it later. The music's going to be there. But again, you should probably talk to an outside opinion just to see.
That's a great point too. That's another way to raise the expectation is not necessarily go deeper with one piece, but maybe move on to a harder piece. And
Right.
that's the next step. Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely.
I think we've already sort of transitioned to reflecting a little bit because thinking about how you played it and going into those 4 opportunities is absolutely reflecting on what you just did. But what other thoughts do you have on how we can reflect more effectively to make our practice more productive?
Keeping a practice journal. I'm going to be hypocritical here because I used to keep a practice journal and I don't anymore, but I keep a mental practice journal and I keep a lot of lists and records and things like that. But having somewhere that you can share all of the information. This was good, need to work on this. Today, my form of a practice journal, like I said, I go through and star things. So as I'm practicing in the margins, I have a star for sections that need work. So it's not really a journal per se, but I know where to pick up the next day. I write tempos in the margin to start out at the next day, keeping track of this was really good. My goals need to be this, keep working on this. So whatever the journal means for you, whatever form works best, I would say just some kind of record keeping. I also have lists upon lists of music I've performed, pieces I want to perform. So not a journal in the typical sense, but I guess goal keeping in the sense of things I want to do, things that I have done and how to get there.
I think that's great to know too, that you don't have to be a super diligent journaler. That's something that's always been kind of intimidating to me. And I've never kept a very diligent practice journal either, but I've seen these ideas of like it's all laid out and bullet journaled and everything's so neatly organized and easy to follow. And I've just never been able to get myself that organized. But just getting it out of your head and putting the stars in the music and having those tempos is a great thing to come back to. I think that's brilliant for just knowing where to pick up with the next day so that you're not starting from scratch. It's very similar to the idea if we were talking about, okay, measure 20 is the problem, but I'm going to go back to the beginning and do it every time. If you have a note that you know measure 20 is what you need to work on next time, then you could just jump right in rather than having to start at the beginning of the piece and re-identify the problem areas. So I think the reflection really ties nicely into going back to the planning stage, and we can sort of create a nice loop in our practice that way.
I think that's a good way to look at it, just the loop, because as I'm thinking about the lists that I have, they're part of the goal keeping, the planning. So even pieces I want to work on, that's a goal, that's the planning. And then yeah, so list keeping and all of this goes hand in hand.
Is there any other like reflection, motivation, inspiration, any other practice ideas or tips that you want to give out there?
I would say for motivation, just to have an inspiring practice space. Again, I think physical space has a lot to do with mental space. So put out photos of things that make you happy, that inspire you, quotes or decorations. Make sure it's not cluttered visually, but also just because it's hard to find things. If you're looking for your cork crease or you don't know where your other box of reeds is, or you're looking for this or that, it's hard to be productive. So keeping things organized and inspirational is a big step of motivation, I feel like. And then also, I have a personal musical philosophy. I don't know if it's directly related to practice, but I think having a rewarding life outside the practice room helps you inside the practice room. So I don't claim to know a lot about like paintings or art or photography or things like this, but it interests me. So I go to exhibitions. I like to travel personally. That's what inspires me. I travel around the world. And I don't know if I could put into words how it impacts my practicing, but it does. Me as a musician, having these experiences makes you more well-rounded. I feel like it opens your brain up to new ideas, new ways of thinking. So another reason to be very productive in the practice room, like I said earlier, I love practicing, but I love doing other things too. So just having a balance between practicing and doing the other things that feed into your role as a musician. So maybe we're getting into a different topic here, but being a well-rounded person helps you be a more well-rounded musician.
I love that so much. I think for me, the like primary function of music is to elicit emotion and convey emotion. And I think having those life experiences can give such a completely different perspective to the music, whether it's something that's very specifically programmatic and trying to convey a specific emotion. If you've never felt that emotion before, it's going to be kind of hard to convey it, or just having more experiences to draw from when you're sort of creating the story of the piece or the emotion that you're trying to convey through the music. I think that's really good advice that maybe isn't always so obvious or something that we would think of off the top of our head. Not to put you too much on the spot, but you sort of are mentioning that you like to be really effective and efficient with your practice. What is your sort of practice schedule like? How much do you practice generally?
Ooh, let me think about that. I would say probably, depending on the time of year, the projects I have going on, probably 4 to 6 days a week. Um, 2 or 3 hours a day. Again, a lot of that is spent on fundamentals. I always start with long tones. I'll usually multitask, so some kind of technique book. I like the Vade-Mecum to get the fingers moving, but I might articulate those, tongue those instead of slur those. Going through Krebs is another favorite, Behrman scales, Yettel scales, and then playing through the music. So at any given point, I'm usually balancing a few programs of music. Coming up, I have some upcoming events in Greece and Cyprus. So I'm trying to balance all the music that I'm playing for these places. So most of my practice routine now is repertoire based, but I never, ever, ever start without a warm up. I learned from that mistake. Like I said, I never used to warm up. And now I'm still trying to make up for my past clarinet sins.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I love that. I'll share for me too, personally, if anybody's interested. I think I practice probably 3 to 5 days a week, and it is very dependent on the projects that I have going. Sometimes, especially like during the COVID times, there was not much repertoire that I needed to practice. So I was just doing my fundamentals 3 times a week, all those good scale patterns and running excerpts and stuff. I use excerpts a lot in my warm-ups too, kind of similar to what you were talking about of incorporating the repertoire. And I think in a warm-up, it's important that you know the music so well that 100% of your bandwidth is on the quality of playing. And out of those excerpts, I've done so many times and practice them so much that the notes and rhythms are automatic. So I can't really think about the quality of playing. But when I have more projects going on, then it's a lot more practicing involved and gearing up for things and having to be really diligent and organized about what I'm practicing when to make sure that I'm well prepared for everything. And yeah, so it's like 3 to 5 days a week. And then I'll usually do an hour and a half to 2 hours. Sometimes I push up to 3 hours, again, depending if I have a lot on the docket or not as much. Something that really stuck with me with the power of warm-ups was in a master class with Romain Guillaume, who's I think he's principal of the Paris Opera at like a very young age, and is a soloist and really great clarinetist. And he had said that he doesn't spend much time practicing music anymore because he knows the repertoire, because he's performed it so many times. And he spends most of his time making sure his reeds are working and doing warm-ups and scales. And I think it sort of flips that idea on its head of like, once you're good enough, then you don't have to do warm-ups anymore. But it's actually, once you're good enough, you learn the music so fast, you have that experience and knowledge that all you have to do is warm-ups and make sure that you're still playing the clarinet your best every day.
Mm-hmm. No, that's so true. Warm-ups will never go away. So that's what I tell students also is I hope you like long tones because they're here forever.
That's fantastic. Yeah. And hopefully by listening to this conversation, you've developed an inspiration to fall in love with your long tones and warm-ups, because I agree that those are the most important. And hopefully there have been some other tips and ideas. Any last ideas you want to share, Jenny?
Have fun. That's why we do it. I know every practice routine can't be the best thing ever, but try and find the joy too. We talked about some of the nuts and bolts for practicing, but remember, it's just clarinet, it's just music. Try and be productive, try and have fun, enjoy the music that you're making.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks so much for joining me on this. I think people will get a lot out of it. Leave a comment to thank Jenny for all of her great practice wisdom. And feel free to leave any practice tips or ideas you have in the comments as well with anything that we didn't cover. Both of us are big practice nerds and are always looking for more ideas and ways that we can be more effective and efficient as well. So thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in another video.
Thank you.
And last but not least, a huge heartfelt thank you to the Dennersons. This is like the Quick Start Clarinet family who supports the channel and helps to make everything that I do possible. If you would like to support the channel and get some awesome rewards in return where we can work one-on-one over video and you can have my full support moving forward on your clarinet journey, then go to quickstartclarinet.com/supporter.